What syncs in the brain links in the brain. And all of a sudden, the person starts to feel more like themselves. There's an integration. So blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, people in wheelchairs that from strokes with paralysis, walking again. I mean, these are profound upgrades biologically. I think if you teach people the what and the why, and there's nothing left to conjecture, to superstition, to dogma, to spirituality, then the how gets easier because it becomes practical. And science is the contemporary language that we use to demystify the mystical. So we started noticing these elegant states where there was global coherence.
And this is being measured. You're doing the brain scans.
We're measuring it in real time.
Right, exactly.
We started bringing in reputable scientists, people that are well published. So when we were doing these studies, we noticed that if we could teach people how to dial down their thinking neocortex, their analytical mind, then the whole entire brain is working like a symphony. And you start feeling whole, and you start feeling clear, and you can think, you're coherent, you can have a vision or an intention of the future. So when that person stands on the stage and they're telling their story and they're the example of truth, they're speaking truth, right? So they've actually applied those principles that were once philosophical, theoretical, that was just basically knowledge, and the application, the personalization, the demonstration created an experience. Experience is really what changes us because it enriches the circuitry in the brain, but the end product of an experience is an emotion, right? And emotion is what teaches our body chemically to understand what our mind intellectually understood. I look out in the audience and people are leaning in. You know, they're looking at truth. They're looking at an example of truth. That is the 4-minute mile. Yeah. That's somebody who broke through a level of consciousness or unconsciousness that says that we can heal by thought alone. So what is the science behind that? So when we started bringing in reputable scientists, people that are well published, that spend their life studying microbiology and cellular function and epigenetics and brainwave function and all these other different elements, thousands of metabolites on a cellular level that could be secreted. We're looking very specifically when we did these studies, so we started studying everything. And we started looking at brains, and we started looking at hearts, and then we started noticing that people would have these very, very, very transcendental moments where there was a significant arousal that took place in their brain. And that arousal, which is typically based in fear, in anger or aggression or in pain, that's a survival response, this arousal was ecstasy. This arousal was bliss. So the amount of energy in those people's brains during that moment of, the only way that I could describe it is connection. That moment produced such a level of energy in the brain that it was hundreds of times normal.
And this is being measured. You're doing the brain scans.
We're measuring it in real time.
Right, exactly.
And then when we see these very, very high degrees of energy in the brain, at the same time, we're seeing a high level of order. Now, not just a little order, not a lot of order, like a supernatural amount of order.
When you say order, Joe, do you mean the coherence between the brain and the heart, or what do you mean by order when you say that?
Okay, so if you're late for an appointment, you got to pick your kid up, there's 10 texts you have to answer, and something went wrong at the office. The arousal of the stress hormones causes us to move into that primitive nervous system of survival. And when we're in stress, we're trying to control, we're trying to predict, we're trying to organize our life because that unknown is, something can go wrong, it's unpredictable. So we shift our attention to one person, to another meeting, to another place we have to go, another time, another thing we have to do, and every single one of those elements has a neurological network in our brain. In fact, the neocortex is really a record of the past, right? So the arousal of those stress hormones causes us to shift our attention to all of these different elements, and we activate those circuits. And like a lightning storm clouds, the brain starts firing very incoherently. When the brain is incoherent, we're incoherent. And when the brain isn't working right, we're not working right. At the same exact time, you're sitting in traffic, you can't really run, there's nowhere to run. You can't really fight, there's no one to fight, and you can't really hide. And so the arousal of this primitive nervous system causes the heart its rate to increase and a respiratory rate to increase, because that was the mechanism of survival. If you're being chased by T-Rex, you better increase your heart rate and your respiratory rate. So now the heart rate and the respiratory rate are increasing, but you're not running, fighting, and hiding. There's a physiological change in your body for emergency, and you're taking all this vital energy that you would use for growth and repair, for long-term building projects, and you're tapping all the body's resources, and you're turning it and converting it into chemistry, right? So now the heart is racing, but you're not using that energy, so it's pumping against a closed system. And it causes the heart to start firing very incoherently. And that's when you stop trusting. That's when you stop loving. That's when you stop communing. That's when you stop cooperating. That's when you stop really creating or thinking about possibilities. Not a time to learn, not a time to go within. And so people spend the majority of their time living in the state. And in that aroused state, those chemicals heighten our senses. And we narrow our focus on the material world, because that's where the danger is. If something's behind the big rock and you hear it moving and it's dark at night and you're walking, you're going to freeze and you're going to narrow your focus, and the arousal is going to heighten your senses. And that kind of narrow focus becomes habituated when people live in constant stress. Now, you can turn on that response just by thinking about your problems. So now the arousal of those chemicals becomes almost like an addiction. It's
the familiar,
and you need the familiar stimulation to reaffirm that emotional state, right? Because that's how we feel alive. So we thought, wow, what if we teach people how to go from that narrow focus to broadening their focus and opening their focus and focusing on nothing material or physical. And when we did that, by sensing space, by sensing nothing, opening and broadening their focus, those different compartments of the brain that were firing out of order incoherently started to synchronize.
Got it.
Now what syncs in the brain links in the brain. And all of a sudden the person starts to feel more like themselves. There's an integration. So we started noticing these elegant states where there was global coherence. In other words, we were measuring many compartments of the brain simultaneously, and when waves are working in order, when they're working in coherence, then the whole entire brain is working like a symphony. And you start feeling whole, and you start feeling clear, and you can think, you're coherent, you can have a vision or an intention of the future. So when we were doing these studies, we noticed that if we could teach people how to dial down their thinking neocortex, their analytical mind, and by sensing space, if you're sensing, you're not thinking or analyzing, you're sensing, and you start slowing your brainwaves from that high beta brainwave state when you're in survival into these lower beta brainwave states, and ultimately into alpha.
Okay. Alpha.
Now, alpha is the creative state. Alpha is the imaginary state. That's when the voice in your head that's talking to you all the time, that default mode kind of shuts off, and your brain starts to see in images and pictures. You start imagining. It's an imaginary state. It's a creative state. So we use that state in the state of creation, but then we took it a little further. What if we could teach a person to slow their brainwaves down even more into theta? And in theta, you're in a hypnotic state. And hypnotic states cause you to be very suggestible to information. And suggestibility is your ability to accept, believe, and surrender to information as the truth without ever analyzing it, and that's what exactly programs the subconscious mind. People who just came to an event that really had no experience in meditation but immersed themselves for 7 days.
Okay.
Our data suggests at the end of 7 days, their body completely looks like they're in a different life, a completely different environment. The science is pointing the finger at there's strong environmental changes going on in the person's biology, but they're in a ballroom.
Right.
Well, there's not a lot of things happening in a ballroom, but so then how does that happen? Okay, so The application then becomes important for everybody, because when we started looking at advanced meditators that didn't have those transcendental states, but they practiced meditation every day, there was a dosing effect. In other words, the more they self-regulated, the more they were resistant to the things in their environment. Well, let's think about that. If I say to you, Ed, why are you upset today? And you say, I'm upset because of the staff member, I'm upset because what I heard on the news, there was traffic, I was late. What you're really saying is, my environment, some person, some condition, something in my outer world is actually having control over the way I feel and the way I think.
Right.
And so that's a subconscious program called victimization. Anything that controls you, the way you feel and the way you think, you're victim to. Now, the problem is that the majority of times our response to the environment weakens the organism.
Okay.
That means that your fear, your anger, your aggression weakens the organism, you. So now the environment is actually causing the organism through the stress hormones to really start down-regulating systems in the body, right? So then,
it's incredible.
So as long as you react to your environment and the response is causing you to become weakened, you're victim to your environment. Well, what makes sense then would you be more susceptible to anything in your environment because you're a victim to it. But the difficulty is that 90% of the thoughts you think are the same thoughts you thought the day before. Nerve cells that fire together wire together. Keep firing the same thoughts, keep making the same choices, keep doing the same things, keep recreating the same experiences that stamp the same networks of neurons into the same patterns, all for the familiar feeling called you. And do that enough times, and your biology, your neurocircuitry, your neurochemistry, your hormones, your gene expression stays the same because you're the same. Okay, so then instead of sitting down and trying to meditate for 10 minutes and say, then believe in the thought I can't meditate, or I don't have enough time, or I'm a really important person, or I got too many emails to answer, or it's garbage day, or it's my mother's fault, it's my ex's fault. That's the personality that has been hardwired and conditioned emotionally into the past that's resisting the unknown. It would rather cling to suffering and take a chance in possibilities. So our events, we say, okay, here's the knowledge, and I can say now with a great degree of certainty, more than ever, that if you actually do this and you stretch yourself a little bit further than where you would normally go at home, your brain will change. And if you teach people how to do this over and over again, and no different than training an animal, the body is the animal.
Are you training the body that you're in charge? Is that what you're doing?
You're telling the body it's no longer the mind, that you're the mind.
Yes.
And when you do that, those victories add up, and then all of a sudden, there's a liberation of energy. There goes the guilt, there goes the pain, there goes the whatever. It doesn't matter if it's health, it doesn't matter if it's wealth or success, it doesn't matter if it's a loving relationship, a change in a career, a mystical experience. Whatever it is, the person all of a sudden starts to relax into the present moment. Now, let's demystify the present moment.
Okay.
People wake up in the morning and they think about their problems, and those problems are memories that are etched in their brain that are connected to certain people and objects at certain times and places. The moment they wake up in the morning and they start thinking of their problems, they're thinking in the past. Okay, now every one of those problems has an emotion associated with it. So when they feel unhappy, when they feel bitter, when they feel fearful, now their body's in the past. Thoughts are the language of the brain, feelings are the language of the body. Thought and a feeling, image and emotion, stimulus and response. You're conditioning the body to be the mind of that emotion subconsciously. Now, the body is believing it's living in the same past experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Why? Because the body's so objective, it doesn't know the difference between the real-life experience that's creating that emotion and the emotion that person is creating by thought alone. And so the environment signals the gene, that's epigenetics. The end product from an experience in the environment is an emotion. The person's signaling the same genes in the same way, and genes make proteins, and proteins are responsible for the structure and function of your body, and the expression of proteins is the expression of life. And now the person is actually headed for a genetic destiny. And when people labor for the present moment, and they take their attention off of their body, off of all the people in their life, all of the objects they own, their cell phone, their computer, their car, their house, they're no longer identifying with where they're sitting, where they need to be, where they live, where they've lived in the past, where they need to go. And they're not thinking about the predictable future or the familiar past. They're dissociating from everything physical and material, everything known. That is the exact moment we call getting beyond yourself.
Got it.
Okay? Now, when we're in that place then, at the beginning it's uncomfortable because survival is the unknown. You have better chances of survival and running from the unknown, but that unknown is the perfect place to create from. So in the process, no different than any rehab. In our first 2 days of our event, really they're basically rehabbing from their emotional states and their habits. And they're sitting in the presence of that discomfort, right? And the discomfort is because the body is leaving the known. But if the body has been conditioned to be the mind, the moment you take it outside of its familiar territory, it's going to start telling you, Ed, why don't you quit? You're not really good at this. You're more of a physical person. You don't really want to do this. You're not very this or very that. And most people just get up when they do the meditation. They believe that thought as if it's true. Now, the question is, what's on the other side of that thought?